survivors, and welcome to First Aid Spray, a Resident Evil podcast by fans for fans. This is episode 91 of the show, and in this edition we're reloading an old save as we return to the PS1 to celebrate 25 years of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. My name is Sai, and joining me on the panel this week, calling in from Raccoon City Press Office, or maybe it's Grill 13 from Steamforge Games, it's Sherwin Matthews.
Stars.
Accidentally using all of his gunpowder A and having to fight Gravedigger with a handgun, it's Kelsey, aka KDB.
Do all the Foxy ladies hate my accent?
And when prompted with a live selection, he always chooses to podcast. It's Fire Button Steve Valance.
Hi, everybody.
Every episode of First Aid Spray is recorded live on our Discord server, so join now to become part of our fantastic community that includes Resident Evil diehards and newbies. And if you'd like, you can support the show via our merchandise store or over at patreon.com/FASprayPod for as little as $1 a month. All of this and all of our social media links can be found at our website, faspraypod.com. A little bit of housekeeping on our side of things. Of course, just a reminder of the new merchandise in case you missed it. Yes, we have the new logo on shirts in green and red form, and mugs and hats. Can recommend. I've bought everything essentially, and also we have a new episode for Patrons available for the next couple of weeks. That'll be coming public around the end of the year. But if you want a sneak peek, listen to Kelsey, Steve, and James talking about their experiences in horror games and horror video game experiences in 2024. We did a little in a moment of relief, and we might have another one coming as well. There are definitely some plans percolating, so yes, go check out the Patreon. No matter how much you support from $1 upwards, you get access to everything now. So speaking of a moment of relief, actually, I'm just going to chuck this in here. Dan Durkin, who was a guest on A Moment of Relief a little while ago when we did the Resident Evil 4 VR review, he and I sat down to rank every Resident Evil game on our day job at What Culture Gaming. So that video is out now. I also put a page on the First Aid Spray website. There's a direct link to it, so you can find it there. The easiest probably, but yes, it's a tiered, I think, experience style ranking of every single game in the series. You'll see where we put Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and you'll see by the end of this podcast, I guess, if I still feel the same way. I guess we'll find out. Cool. I think that's everything from us. Steve, take us into the news.
George A. Romero's Resident Evil documentary is slated for a 7th of January release in the United States.
So this is coming from Brandon Salisbury, who is a director and a guest documentarian now. A lot of excitement around this, especially around the community, because he's also worked with lots of names, many of which have been on this show, including Romby, who we had on recently as well. I think we might have even talked about this documentary on the podcast, I'm not sure. But yes, Romby from the Resident Evil podcast and various other names as well. It's been a long time coming, certainly, and it's nice to have an idea of a release date in the 7th of January in the US. And in terms of Europe, I don't know if there's necessarily a concrete date, but if you did do a Google, I did find one German website that has pre-orders for the film slated for 27th of February. So hopefully that's kind of a more European based. But I guess it's launching on the internet, so, VPNs exist. Either way, it's coming next year, finally. Very exciting stuff. Steve, any interest in this?
Much like the Itchy Tasty book by Alex, I feel like this is a perfect companion piece for anyone who's ever curious about the film we never got. Obviously, there's the leaked script, but other than a short video vignette, we've been kind of light on details, so it'll be nice to go in depth as people can. I am very much looking forward to finding out as much as I can because, well, I've always been a fan of George A. Romero's work anyway. I have a bit of a passing enjoyment of Resident Evil, I think, So, yeah, I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think there's lots of curiosos in the Resident Evil history books, 1.5 and, like you say, that kind of thing, that have been covered over the years. But this feels like, despite the fact that the script has been online for a long time, the sort of behind the scenes has kind of remained somewhat of a mystery. So to be able to get closer to it and understand the history behind that's very exciting for me. Sherwin, any interest in this? I don't think any of us are really that into the Resident Evil movies, but are we curious about the what if to this?
It's a weird one. I think I land in the same place as I do about RE 1.5, which is I think I prefer the myth to reality. Something about RE 1.5 is, I think, excuse me, the majesty of it is the fact that it was this forbidden thing that will never truly exist. And I'm very much someone who goes by the adage of satisfaction is the death of desire. I don't know whether I'd like to know about this forgotten thing as much as it can keep its mystique and continue to be mysterious to me, to be honest.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, I guess there's still part of the mystique because, I mean, they are not making the movie. It's more about why it didn't happen. So it'll be interesting to get more of the mystique. But
right, but if it ends up being, you go, actually, that did
too
sound
much.
that sounds a bit ropey. But then there is a very, very low bar unless you're KDB for Resident Evil movies. So there is this.
I was about to say, I said we aren't fans of the movies, but I've misspoken. Kelsey, any interest in the Romero doc?
No taste, a lot of you. I mean, Sherwin kind of just hit the nail on the head, really. Like, it's so weird that this documentary is going to come out like nearly 30 years after this film was supposed to go into production, and in that time, I'm wondering how much information and story there is to actually tell. Like, we know there's a script. I don't know if Romero was involved in this documentary at all, if he's going to be interviewed or anything like that. If he is, then I am super interested to see him talk about what his take on it would have been. But I don't know if it's going to be a bit kind of maybe filling holes where there's nothing to fill it with. And yeah, I am intrigued to watch it, but I like the idea of it being a bit of a myth and the whole mythology of it, because I feel like if there was something really interesting to tell, maybe we would have heard it, but I could be completely wrong. So I'm definitely going to watch this. It's just mad that it's taken so long for something to come together, I suppose. It feels very much fan pushed thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is fine. Like, I'm all for that. But yeah, I suppose definitely intrigued. And like Steve said, I'm a Romero fan as well. So I really hope he's involved in some way. If he's not, I guess, we'll see.
Well, I mean, there will be, I know they've spoken to people who are close to him when he was alive and will have stories about, at the time when he was writing it or being involved with it, and maybe since as well. Whether or not there's any existing footage talking about it, that is definitely an interesting question. That would be cool, but I'm not expecting that. But either way, going in with no expectations, but hoping to enjoy it, I guess, is the general vibe.
Other piece of news this time, Resident Evil 4 Remake has received a mysterious update on the PlayStation 5.
Not a lot to say on this one. I think there's more a case of making assumptions that are probably correct. Yes, there was a patch for the PS5 version of the game specifically a few days ago, as of recording this, about a week ago, I think. And there's no patch notes for it. It was blank at the time. But there have been a lot of patches of PS5 games going on right now, obviously with the release of the PlayStation 5 Pro. Some games requiring many patches and still not working, but that's a different thing entirely. So expectation is perhaps this is for something to do with the PS5 Pro, which is obviously one of the things that separates it, the PlayStation version from the Xbox version. The other one being VR, but I imagine there would have been patch notes. So this might be preemptive sort of patching for an eventual PS5 Pro reveal. That's the assumption, which I guess is potentially cool, but the install base for that console is so low, I can't imagine that many people are that excited about it. But if you are, then there you go. Potentially something to look forward to, I guess. I don't know if anybody's really got anything to say on this other than cool.
I'm really happy for the 12 people who own the PS5 Pro.
Yep.
But go for it and have at it, ladies and gents.
I'd like to be happy for them, but I can guarantee the first patch won't work, judging by all the rest.
I reckon it's going to be RE4 2, the same way as it did Final Fantasy X2, and it's actually Ashley Graham's adventures post-game, which is just running around with her friends and doing all sorts of things with Ganados.
Separate ways.
Exactly. Separate kind of J-pop ways.
Okay, cool. I guess that'll do it for the news, which takes us into our subject for this episode, which is our return to Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. And now, reading the file, Marvin's report from Resident Evil 3 Nemesis in character as Marvin Branagh, Dylan Nicholson, who you can follow on Twitter @SunsNichol.
September 24th. There are reports of a theft in the municipal building before dawn. A jewel-decorated clock at the main gate was damaged. 2 of 12 gems that are installed on the face of the clock are missing. Due to lack of available officers at this time, I have no choice but to suspend the research of this case. Signed, Marvin Brenner. September 26th. Based upon an autopsy report of a 42-year-old restaurant owner, I have discovered that he has one of the missing gems. He apparently took shelter in the police department at about 10 a.m., where he was shot to death within 10 minutes of having developed the symptoms. Since the city is currently under martial law, we are forced to suspend this case. At this time, we'll keep the gem as evidence. Signed, Marvin Brenner.
Okay, we are here again. Resident Evil 3, a game that we covered way back in season 1 of the show. But it's been many years, and we got some new voices on this episode. So it seemed appropriate to kind of return to it because, yes, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is celebrating sort of the period of its 25th anniversary. It released in September 22nd, 1999 in Japan, November 11th, 1999 in the US, and February 21st, 2000 in Europe. So kind of by recording in December, I guess we're with the virtue of landing somewhere in the middle of all of those celebrations. And also, next year, I can't believe I'm saying this, Resident Evil 3 Remake, April 3rd, 2020, will be 5 years old. Yes, so it seemed appropriate for us to sort of reconvene as we've grown as a podcast, as we have new voices, and also with the context of the remake and the dust well and truly settled, you should think, 5 years on, to see how we feel about Resident Evil 3 and where it sits across the Resident Evil canon in general. Again, Steve and I have spoken about our experiences with Resident Evil 3 way back in season 1, so we don't necessarily need to go into how we first came across it, but we do have some new voices on. So Sherwin, as someone that was already a Resident Evil fan established by the release of Resident Evil 3, do you remember being excited for this? Do you remember your thoughts at the time?
That's a weird one. I was trying to think about this over the last few days. I remember one of my friends had a Japanese import copy of it. Or more precisely,
Nice.
like a pirated version of it, I guess. Whatever. This is like
Seems to be the game for it, so it's fine.
This is like 1,000 years ago, so I can't remember these things, these small details. But I remember playing it like a little bit there and running through. And there is a moment in the game which I swear was in that game, which I will ask you guys about later on, because I've never ever seen it in any other playthrough that I've had. But anyway, we'll come back around to that. But
Exciting.
But yeah, I remember playing it a little bit then, and then I have a massive gap and not really playing it again for like a couple of years or whatever else. I think I genuinely just sort of skipped it for a bit because I didn't actually own a PlayStation way back when. So it wasn't until I got my own PlayStation, which was, it would have been at least a year after the actual game released, that I actually sat down and played it properly. So I had a bit of a delayed experience with it, but that said, loved it. As soon as one of the very first games I got for my PlayStation, and then just played it until I'm amazed the disc hasn't just ground down to sand by now. But it's one of the strongest games in the release. I've got a controversial opinion that will make you cringe, Si, later on. So, but there we are.
I look forward to it. I think
Never done that before.
Kelsey, what are your earliest memories of RE3?
Speaking of cringe, my memory of this game is incredibly vivid because of something cringy. RE1 and 2 were obviously games I absolutely loved and played religiously at the time, and both me, my brother, and all my friends, we all loved it. And when RE3 Nemesis launched in the UK, my younger brother's birthday is the 3rd of March, so completely of his own accord, with no arm twisting from me whatsoever, my brother asked my dad for RE3 for his 11th birthday. And when his birthday arrived, he'd opened his presents and he got RE3, and then he proceeded to go outside and play football with his friends, and I volunteered to stay indoors by myself and play the game for him. So that's what I did, and I can remember this as if it was yesterday. So I was locked in. I remember being absolutely buzzing beyond belief that I was playing the next Resident Evil game, and I also made it clear to all of my brother's friends and him, that anytime I encountered Nemesis, I would shout out the window, "Nemesis alert, Nemesis alert," and they'd all come running in and watch the sequence with Nemesis.
Amazing.
With me, and then they'd leave, when the Nemesis bit was over. So yeah, and that has just been with me forever. I look back on that moment as the first time I played Resident Evil 3. That's what I was doing, and I remember thinking it was great. I remember thinking it was really hard, really difficult. Loving like all the apparent little secrets and stuff about it, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And then over time, I think my opinion has changed and changed again, and just kind of looking forward to talking a bit more about that today.
So the cringe part, I assume, is the fact that everyone else went outside to play football instead of playing Resident Evil 3. That's what you mean, right?
You got it.
Yeah, I was going to say, what? I don't get it otherwise.
Losers.
Let's get into it then. We broke down sort of individual gameplay parts of Resident Evil 3 and obviously the various editions it did sort of piece by piece last time. But I want to start with that sort of generally, broadly about Resident Evil 3's gameplay and those additions, referring to the dodge mechanic, ammo crafting, and leveling up your ammo crafting the more you do it as well, and stuff like this, and to a certain extent the live selections as well, I suppose. Although obviously everyone talks about Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is the more action slanted game of perhaps not just the PlayStation 1 games, but of the sort of fixed camera angle, sort of tank control, classic Resident Evil games. It's probably the most action heavy. I guess my first question to everyone is, did we feel like, sort of depending on what context you want to take it, this was a logical jump from RE2? Because when I think about it, despite the fact that there is a lot of obvious crossover between the way the games look and the way, to a certain extent, the way the games play, it does feel like a big leap to have all of this stuff all of a sudden in a game that only came, in Japan, in terms of Japan, a year and a half later. Steve, how do you feel about RE3 as an action game and following RE2?
Honestly, I'm pretty happy with it because, like, and the franchise now, there's a bigger gap, but the fact that they managed to achieve so much with so little time, like I said, a year and a half, like we have entirely new mechanics. Yes, they reuse the RPD, but other than that, they make a vastly more detailed looking, desolated Raccoon City, the park, the Dead Factory rather, all these new sets, they all look of a quality that is a rung above, and that's just before you even look at the mechanics of the models. The way monsters interact, the way you kind of delimb and various other things. Not to mention how sophisticated Nemesis as a monster fight is. He's the first enemy in the franchise to have HP that carries over from room to room. In previous games, you shoot a thing and it resets when you come back if you don't kill it. So there's a lot going on. I think it's great. It's almost a bit of a harsh mark towards Code Veronica with how much it managed to pull off with the seamless stairs and whatnot. It's, the big bugbear is obviously the dodge system.
Always.
And while I'm sure we're all a bit older, a bit wiser, it's still a clunky system, to be sure. Like, I'll sing its praises, but it's still a busted and broken system.
Yeah, I think what you talked about there really made me think. Do you know when you were a kid, or even now, whatever, no judgment, you'd get like as one of the cheap action figures that only have like 2 points of articulation, and then you get something that has like a crazy amount, elbows, shoulder joints, everything. That's what it feels like between RE2 and RE3 in terms of the way that it looks and moves, I guess. Like everything's like the animations are way more complex. Some of the stuff is, drag and drop, the way that maybe some of the player characters move in cutscenes and stuff. But Nemesis moving and running around like that, it was really unlike anything from RE2.
I mean, case in point, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to hold the mic, but if you can mentally visualize how a Licker moves and operates in Resident Evil 2, and then think about how a Hunter Beta moves and the way that they have like lip flaps that actually roar and the like, it's night and day in terms of evolution. Not dismissing RE2, obviously, we know my feelings on that game, but yeah, they definitely stepped up their game for what is a small iterative upgrade in the grand scheme.
Kelsey, how do you feel about it? Sort of, upgrading from RE2 in an action sense, or I guess otherwise.
Yeah, that analogy about the action figure, that is spot on. Bravo for that. That is really good. Because, I was thinking about, like, trying really hard to think about this. And I think at the time, if someone asked you to predict what was going to be next for the gameplay, what this game is probably isn't what people would have said RE3 would be. As time has gone on, it maybe feels a bit more logical. And, people, as you mentioned about the action, people say RE2 is actiony, but it is here where it's so fast paced and so actiony and there's so much going on that it feels like it almost feels like this amped up bonus mode for RE2. And with the dodging, like the ridiculous dodging, the vast amounts of ammo, unbelievable amounts of enemies, particularly zombies, you'll just get reams and reams of zombies, which every time I play this game, it's just like, I'm always blown away with how many zombies there are and how many enemies. And there's multiple times in the game where you think, how many hunters or how many zombies? And, you're worried for your ammo. Generally, you can have quite a lot of ammo, so it's okay, but they can be quite tanky as well. So it does keep you on your toes. And I do wonder if, because this game was originally a spin-off, as far as I'm aware, it was originally a spin-off that got kind of promoted to be the third in the series. And spin-offs kind of come with, like, they're sort of off the leash a little bit, and they come with these weird left field choices and experiments for a franchise, because maybe there's like less of a, like Sauron's eye watching them, because all the focus is on, it's all on the mainline stuff. And so in this case, I think it works in lots of ways. It works so much in the game's favor, because they obviously thought, okay, we can experiment a bit with this. It's not the main game. Nobody's going to really play it. Maybe that's what they were thinking. So they just kind of let loose a little bit. And it certainly wasn't what I was expecting at the time. And it wasn't really what I wanted, but it is a unique experience that has felt kind of more natural as time has gone on. And I think those new additions are something that I can look back on now and really appreciate, that the fact that they crammed it all in that short space of time is just, it's kind of wild, really. And I think, we talked about on the Remake 4 podcast how one of my biggest gripes was that game was missing a dodge. And so it's like, that game was weirdly like a step back when you think of what RE3 was doing. And, the RE3 Remake had a dodge as well. And just playing it again recently, it is wild how much is in there. And people say RE2 is the big action, it's the action movie, it's the James Cameron action movie, which it sort of is, but this is nuts, this game. And there are some things that maybe I'd enjoy less about it, but gameplay wise, I did not expect what this is. You're facing off with a tyrant within the first 5 minutes. It's just it's what I mean when I say it's a bit like a bonus mode. So there's other stuff to say as well, but I feel like logical step, it's, at the time I was like, no, this doesn't feel logical. This is really weird, and maybe why I didn't like it as much at the time. But looking back, I do have massive appreciation for what they did with the gameplay.
There are loads of different perspectives that you can have on this, and also loads of different perspectives from the same context. Like, if I'm looking at it from where we are now, on the one hand, there's a part of me that will always be like, it's a shame we've only got a handful of these classic Resident Evil games. But at the time, Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2, and now by making Resident Evil 3, and also simultaneously working on, Code Veronica, let alone Dino Crisis and other stuff like this, Outbreak, I'm sure the devs were itching to see, what can we actually do with this engine and this idea? Well, how far can we stretch this? What can we do to give this our own identity? As fans, at the time, and especially now, if you're like a fan of that specific kind of Resident Evil, sometimes you just kind of want more of the thing you love. But the developers were probably just like, we've done that already. Like, what else 100%. Can we do to make this its own unique thing? And also, similarly, in terms of looking back at the context now, because you really hit on a thing for me where it's like, you can really see throughout Capcom's development in Resident Evil and other games, as you say, there'll be stuff in spin-offs that they try out, and then maybe that gets refined further into a main series game or just another Resident Evil game. And that also includes other series, and we talked about this before, so I'm not going to go too deep on it because we've covered Dino Crisis 2 as its own podcast many, many moons ago. But when you look at the Capcom release schedule, it is really interesting to see that, because we talked about how Dino Crisis 2 kind of feels like a proto Resident Evil 4 in some ways. And you can kind of thread the needle here from Resident Evil through to Dino Crisis 2 to Resident Evil 4. That amp up of like Capcom looking at the rise in more action-focused video games in general that was kind of there in the PS1, but really hit when the PS2 came. So everyone knew that wave was coming. And they were just trying to refine that and figure out how to make an action game that was really going to click and be flashy and just instantaneous with people, rather than, yes, a slow, plodding horror game, if you like. Sherwin, how do you feel about Resident Evil 3 as it sits amongst its, I guess it's just all of its peers, and Resident Evil 2 in particular?
It's interesting. At the time when I played it, it's interesting to hear those perspectives, because what I do remember playing at the time is it felt very natural. It just felt like it was the natural evolution of RE. And in the same way that you look at RE1 and then you look at RE2, it's slightly polished, right? It's the same engine. You've still got tank controls. You're still moving around the same way. But the graphics are a bit nicer. The zombies look a bit smoother. The menus are a bit easier to pass. The gameplay's a touch more sophisticated in terms of quick turns, raw aims, or whatever else. And that happens from Resident Evil to Director's Cut through to Resident Evil 2. And it kind of goes into Resident Evil 3 in the same way. And there's a lot more steps. You are looking at ammo crafting and all the other bits and pieces we just talked about. And there's definitely something which I think we can go on to. Or I think if I remember from looking at the show notes, you wanted to talk about like the idea of potential sequels to this, or what is the future.
Yeah, go for it.
This. But we can jump into that in a second. But like I think with this, at the time it felt very much like this is what Resident Evil 2 wanted to get to. Like the engine is here now. We don't need to worry about building that or polishing it as much, because it's already quite polished already. So now we can put more focus into the smaller little bits, the ancillary areas where we can now sort of turn our attention to it. We wanted to, but we didn't really have the bandwidth to do so. So hey, let's be able to make gunpowder and give player complete complete choice over what type of ammo they make, rather than kind of just mixing, effectively mixing herbs, but with ammo. Do we, looking at the randomization of enemies and item locations and stuff, we always wanted to do that, but we didn't have time to work on that subsystem. Well, now we do, because again, Resident Evil 2 has kind of happened and a lot of the optimization's already done, so we can put our attention there elsewhere. I think that's kind of how it felt a lot, I think. And I think Resident Evil 3 certainly plays up to the tone of the game. It's a much more frenetic, much darker, much more dangerous game than RE2. There's parts of RE2 in fact large parts of RE2 which are very plodding, and that's not meant in a bad sense. It's very tense. It's lots of empty corridors after you've cleared it of enemies. It's lots of very suspenseful moments. It's kind of being left alone on your own in large sections and kind of waiting for that thing that might jump out of the shadows to get you or whatever else. Whereas Resident Evil 3 is like, no, the thing's jumped out of the shadows. It's here right in front of you. How are you going to deal with it? It's right in your face.
Yes.
And that's pretty much the entire game as you go on, because it sells that idea of you are lost in this place. It is not safe. You need to get out. And, there's lots of ways that RE3 really amps that up. For example, one of the things which is so incredible at the game, we obviously talked about, you guys talked about it in the first episode, is how much, even though you are still moving around in rooms, the thing feels like an open city. That's the biggest achievement it has. And that's not even like one of the mechanical changes. It's just this more sophisticated approach to what Resident Evil is, and the more considered approach to it. I'm going to hit the pause because you guys all want to speak, I'm sure.
Well, no, to be fair on that point, like absolutely, take that a little bit for granted sometimes, but the boldness, and also kind of to the point of what we said before, I said in the last point about you try out something in one game and then you apply it to the next one with that experience. It's a little bit of running around a little bit of City at the beginning of RE2 to kind of understand how that would work in terms of, as you say, these essentially are rooms, but they're made to look like one continuous outside area. But it's quite bold to make that a large part of the game and hope that it clicks and doesn't feel like a bunch of boxes that you're moving from box to box. And obviously they did an incredible thing with it, because it's one of the, I think, most commonly occurring compliments about the game was just how good it felt to actually get to explore a little bit more of Raccoon City. And when people think of Raccoon City, I would think a lot of people, RE3 comes to mind first because you spend so much time kind of in the heart of it instead of just one location that happens to be in it, or in the case of RE1, obviously, one location that happens to be kind of on the cusp of it.
Yeah. I'd also say, I'm moving slightly away from that, but I think in terms of the action focus, which we talked about earlier, this is almost to some degrees a trendsetter in the genre. Like, it kind of pushed it. Like Silent Hill 3, which came out after, unless you're about to correct me and I'm horribly wrong, also makes this exact nosedive into action focus, and arguably nowhere near as well. I think Resident Evil 3 really keeps up and feels like it's a Resident Evil game, and doesn't feel like it's deviating from the focus of what the game should be. It has tension, it has suspense, it has danger, but in different ways to the first two, and that's great. I think Silent Hill 3 amps it up, and I think you lose something of the Silent Hill-ness of what it is. I think it loses some of its brand identity doing it. And there's other games, that, as we talked about, in terms of the action focus and the steer towards that. And this is perhaps where we sort of make the step into the next sort of conversation point, which is,
go for it.
is kind of what carried on. For me, I think there's a big shame in the sense that, RE4 happened and was RE4, and we're not going to get into that for obvious reasons. There are some people who love that, there are some people who don't like that, whatever else. For me, Resident Evil 3, in a big way, is stepping in a JRPG direction. You look at it, you have the randomized locations of enemies, you have the randomized locations of items, you have something where you have branching story paths where you can do different things and they affect different outcomes and different other stuff that's happening later on in the game. Different cutscenes appear, different characters might die, that sort of stuff. You have alternate endings, like proper alternate endings, and different sort of directions. One of the things that I've never managed to ever get, for whatever reason, whenever I play it, is Nikolai and his helicopter. He always gets murked by Nemesis. To this day, I never know how to actually achieve Nikolai and a helicopter, which is fine, but that never happens for me. But for other people, like yourself, you're like, that always happens. Why would that not be it? I get a very different ending to you guys whenever I play this game. So it just kind of gives us that idea. Like, I could almost see a world where, assumed Resident Evil 4 is not the direction that Capcom went, it's a different game, I can see a much more open world, much less linear, much more open and almost RPG-like Resident Evil that could have evolved from this and actually could have expanded up. And that would have been really, really interesting. So,
to a certain extent, parts of that, I think, feel like they've moved into RE4, but that is just the nature of it having lots of big areas and kind of letting you explore at your own pace, whether you rush through them or you kind of take in the environment, and there's loads of interactable parts of the environment in RE4 and stuff like that. But you're right, it is, once you beat the chapter, onward you go, you're not coming back. And I could certainly see that if there was another game, probably not on the PS1, it would probably have to have been a PS2 game, but something that followed RE3 closer. I could absolutely see that, and it's also funny as well because it's something that we're talking about in recent years in terms of lots of franchises going in that sort of direction, and people like to point out the Evil Within 2 and how it kind of did open world survival horror or open world horror. And is that something that Resident Evil might explore in the future? Because we do have a bit of a problem with, I guess, linearity. I like a good linear game, but Resident Evil Village, for example, for all the things that I enjoy about that game, it is just, you've got one small area with a bunch of it's bolted onto it, and you do those in a specific order, and you even do the open area in a specific order. It would be nice to see, again, as you said multiple times, that was kind of them experimenting for something like a bigger version of that. Kelsey, in terms of sorry, go on.
One quick thing. I
sure.
100% agree. My favourite part of Resident Evil 4 Remake is the part where Leon's in his boat and you can just bomb around on, go discover Chicken Island and other stuff like that. That's kind of cool. That's a fun part of the game.
Mm-hmm. I think, on our review podcast, I think we all pretty much shouted that out immediately, didn't we? It's just like, when you got there, it was like, oh, this is different. This feels different. Like, just this part alone is very memorable. Kelsey, if Resident Evil 3 got more sequels in the same vein, do you think we would get more action-oriented games? Do you think we get more open-world games? What would you have expected from it?
Yeah, like, I suppose I should be clear. It's funny because although I say, like, because I completely agree with everything that kind of you're both are saying, when I think about it not being the logical step, I think the only reason I come to that conclusion is because of how much I loved Resident Evil 2. And then, Si, how you just mentioned how you like a good linear game. And so do I. And the story of RE2 is so strong and so good, but then it still doesn't feel linear because of the two characters and because of the multiple scenarios. There's still, you've got this thing that then Sherwin's talking about with it's not open world, but there is so much to discover through the different stories. And that's the thing that really drives Resident Evil 2. Whereas with Resident Evil 3, it is absolutely the gameplay. And looking back in hindsight, and I think I've said this before many times, it's like there's a lot of argument to be made that Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a better game than Resident Evil 2. It's just not necessarily one that I enjoy playing as much for different reasons. And then when I look back today, it's like all the stuff that it's doing, yeah, it does make sense that they put it into this game. And I think Capcom were maybe if you look at Code Veronica, which to me has always felt less of a spin-off and more of like a direct continuation of Resident Evil 2, both in terms of gameplay and story beats and the way the story unfolds, Capcom, maybe this just kind of creeped up on them. And because, as I mentioned, the developers were off the leash and kind of just allowed to cram and do whatever they want and experiment because they had a bit more free reign. And I could absolutely see, looking back now, how this could be the trendsetter, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Is it something that I want personally? I don't know. It depends. Like, I really love RE4 Remake a lot, and that is super action and super nonsense at times, but gameplay wise it is pretty special. And I keep going back and forth on it because for the longest time I saw this game as not like the run to the litter. That is a really stupid way to put it, but playing it in recent years and since doing this show, and I was going to touch on this in my conclusion, it's just the perspective you get with all the other games since, and you've touched on this already tonight, Si, it's just you see everything that makes sense about Resident Evil 3 and what it's done for the series. And yeah, I'm rambling a little bit, but I think it would have been awesome to see more, and I'm not opposed. Like, I'm always crying out for franchises to do different things. Like we just seen, like, Elden Ring just got a new game released, new game revealed that's not a classic RPG game. It's like a co-op action game. Yeah. And I'm sure there's lots of people who absolutely love Elden Ring that are very angry about that because it's not Elden Ring 2. That doesn't mean that game that's coming out isn't going to be incredible for what it is. And I am fine with franchises being let off the leash and doing stuff and doing different things. And I'm not going to maybe go as far as to make the joke about the kart racer, but, you know, it's just I could see a Resident Evil RPG. I could see a Resident Evil open world. Do I necessarily want? Not really. Like, I'm quite happy with the clever linearity stuff, but if they give me a good open world with all this stuff that Sherwin's talking about as well, then yeah, it has the potential to be one of the best games in the franchise. So they just need to pull it off, and they just need to do it right, I suppose.
Not to turn this into like a state of the Resident Evil address, but absolutely. And this is one of the things that I have issues with all these remakes. Like, they're great games, but we used to get weird stuff throughout the series where we're going to try a game where we've got multiple perspectives and do some light gun stuff. And we don't get spin-offs anymore because we get remakes instead, I guess, which is obviously just down to taste and stuff like that. And Capcom, as we said, can experiment in other titles and bring it forward. And experiment on stuff that they obviously don't release. They can experiment on in-house, just as a sort of tech demo, and I'm sure they do. But I do miss that, and I would love to see that kind of stuff return and just sort of play with what Resident Evil could be again, because we've always said it since the beginning of the show that Resident Evil was so many different things to so many different people. But I almost do feel like in the last few years that that's less of the case, because they've found the thing that was successful, and they kind of hit it over and over again. And stuff like RE3 which was, as you've described, as like developers potentially being on, a looser leash because it was originally a spin-off game. It's kind of funny to think about it, really, as a separate point, that might well be true, that they had like the scenario drafted up and they were just like, yeah, we're going to use this. Oh, by the way, it has like 3 at least potentially different endings. I mean, some of the stuff is kind of much of a muchness. The city blows up, Jill and Carlos get out, whatever. But also the fate of Nikolai is a big question mark, stuff like that. Resident Evil 2 and 1 obviously have their own questions about who the playable character is and how things end. But yeah, it just seemed like, oh yeah, we had it, and they're like, oh okay. At this point, we were trying to construct a franchise because Resident Evil 2 was originally written to be kind of the end of the story, but no, they're trying to blow this thing wide open, and they seem like, no, we've made a bad guy, but we don't know if he dies or not yet. Down to the player, I guess. And I don't think we see that from Resident Evil after 3. Until Revelations 2 has 2 potential endings, and one is obviously the non-canon ending, and one is the canon ending. We don't have any other Resident Evil games since 3, I think, that have multiple endings. I don't think you can count Survivor. The only differences are like what villain you face, what villain gets murked by the tyrant. Like, it doesn't actually have any different actual endings. But yeah, it's a weird one that we continue to have that trend. Suddenly, out of a big jump of, oh, our villain, we don't know what happens to him, and then no alternative endings, super linear stories. Steve, how would you feel about, what would your sort of dream ideas have been out of a Resident Evil 3 successor? I guess we did get some, really, but like in an alternate universe.
Honestly, I feel like Revelations 2, like there's some chapters in it which get a bit more open and you can explore and do, poke around nooks and crannies. Stuff like that where you can actually affect the gameplay. I would argue we're giving RE3 a bit too much credit, in fairness. I feel like the opening hours of Resident Evil 1 and where you can go are very evocative of the main area where it's open in 3, which is basically the bit after the first Nemesis encounter in the RPD up until you fix the tram, right? Picking up those parts. I think that whole scope is what something modern Resident Evil is slowly losing. And despite one bit with the boat, like we've already said in RE4 Remake, it's kind of... that magic coming back would be fantastic. And a spiritual Resident Evil 3 2... oh my god. Yeah, of course there will be J-Rock bits and, dress spheres and the like, but we're going to go past that point. I think playing into it, maybe dabble with the nebulous nature of canon, because the RE3, all we need to know is at some point Jill escapes, a bomb goes off in Raccoon City. That's it. The entire story itself, depending on your life selection choices, can affect certain person's mindset, person's fate. That whole stuff is great. But how you turn it into a big open sprawling adventure and then still have to have like a linear funnel at the end is basically the problem. It's the closing the game out bit, because you can't leave it in an open state, because that would mean then you're constantly having an ever open world GTA like sandbox to play in where you can't have a story that finishes. You know what I'm saying?
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, I'm sure there are plenty of open world games out there where it's like if you progress to this point, this beyond this point,
the story finishes, but then the game dials back so you can.
But then I would just have it so that it's like, well, you have to load your last save if you want to carry on playing. But I see the point in terms of tonally and stuff like that, where it's just kind of weird that you can be left to live in this apocalyptic area the series that doesn't have apocalypses.
The thing that keeps coming to mind is the Dead Rising games, specifically the third one, which is set in like an entire city that's gone, to hell in a handbasket. But obviously that lacks a lot of the threat and tension that a Resident Evil game would have, and having a persistent or semi-persistent stalker like Nemesis roaming around, where say you're doing your explorations and you're finding supplies, you're doing a side quest, and then Nemesis could just appear and throw a massive curveball. That sounds fantastic to me. Having him be a sudden stalker that you can be expecting of but don't know when he's going to arrive. That in an open world setting terrifies me in the best possible way. Not too dissimilar to what Amnesia the Bunker did, only that has its own issues I won't go into because this is a Resident Evil podcast, not an Amnesia the Bunker podcast.
You've actually kind of, appropriately brought us to the next point that I wanted to talk about, and we've always sort of mentioned it along the way, is the sort of openness of Resident Evil 3. The live selections have been mentioned, the various choices that you make, the order of events that play out and where they play out, and obviously enemy and item placement is a little bit randomised as well. And we haven't really talked too much about the remake yet, and there will be a section where I'm just going to open the floor to that as a more broad discussion. But I'll tell you what, having played Resident Evil 3 Nemesis again for the first time in a few years in preparation for this, and playing it a little bit early as well, so I've had a little bit extra time, I was like, do you know what, I'm going to play Remake 3. It's been a few years, keep saying I'm going to do it, I'm going to play Remake 3. And it is nuts how quickly you get to getting to the end of Uptown, Downtown. You know, obviously in Remake 3 you go to the sewer before you sort of progress. But in terms of collecting the parts for the train, the version of that in Remake 3, which is turning the power on, it's so funny, the difference, because Remake 3, I'm playing it on hardcore, so it's taken me ages because I haven't played it forever and I'm terrible at it. But in terms of my game time, 25 minutes in. And I'm sure Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is probably not as long as it feels when you look at it, because I played the whole game time like 3.5 hours. I got through it. So, but still, that is most of the game, that part, it feels like. Whereas in the remake, it's over so quickly, that bit. And all the stuff, it's just go here, go here, go here, and basically this order, your route to get there may have like 2 or 3 alternatives. Whereas in the original game, as Sherwin has pointed out, I do the same thing every single time, and I need to not do it next time I play. I need to deliberately go different ways, because I always go to the restaurant, to Grill 13, and I always pick this and pick that with my live selections. So I always get the same endings and the same scenes. But the sheer degree of that choice, and I know they're out there and I've seen these scenes and I've heard the voice lines that are only in certain parts, is really cool. And it's certainly a factor in terms of this game is shorter than the original RE2. Obviously, it's only got 1 playable character as opposed to 2. But if anything, it is far more replayable because of all those differences. Steve, how do you feel about the openness of Resident Evil 3, the randomness of it?
I pretty much, I feel like more of this, please. It's a shame we haven't got it more. The fact that you can affect how the story goes. I mean, obviously, it's smaller things, like go to the press office or go to the restaurant. Go to the petrol station first, go to the clinic first. But stuff like that makes the journey yours. And I know it's more scripted than we think in the way that Nemesis behaves. Like, you go here first, then Nemesis is going to show up here instead. But the fact that it feels like spontaneous, it feels like he could appear at any time, it adds that kind of unique spice to it. In comparison, like the way you're describing Resident Evil 3 Remake to me, and I know this is probably something we're going to get into earlier, but it's like the difference between going to a one big ass roller coaster or going around an entire theme park. The original is going around a whole theme park. Maybe it's a bit more measured, but and then 3's just like on and on and on and on. And I'm a defender of 3 Remake, but in comparison,
absolutely,
it's definitely a bit more of a malleable and personal story you could put your own stake into, and even something as simple as choosing whether you jump off the tram, or you stay and secure the brake can affect how the next few story beats play out. So for some reason, this entire situation controls Carlos's mood and whether he's going to save the day or just give you some ice grenades and go, yeah, see you later, Jill, have fun.
To be fair, Steve, if I was on a train that was about to crash and someone said, do you know what, we should stay on this, we'll be fine, that would probably determine how I felt about them afterwards.
Would you be spontaneously drawn to jump out of the window?
Maybe. It sort of depends, doesn't it, I guess. But that is the example that comes to mind, certainly. And there are a few, but that one comes to mind because of you get a couple of different cutscenes, the way that Carlos behaves, but that also impacts the boss fight. He either takes out Nemesis's rocket launcher or he throws you some grenades. Stuff like that's really cool. Sherwin, how do you feel about all the different choices in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis? As you said, you never get certain endings.
No,
so are you kind of like stuck on a certain playthrough, or do you try and mix it up?
So this time around, I also played this in advance because I've played RE3 possibly more than I played RE2. And I thought I would try it in a different way. And I literally made all of the opposite decisions to what I normally would get, and then still got to the same point. I'm like, what did I do that made this I don't know how to get Nikolai in a helicopter. I just don't know how to achieve that. And I'm sure all of the people in this call, Steve knows, because of course Steve knows.
I mean, yes, I do.
I literally went, right, okay, so normally my key beats are, start out kind of, outside the RPD building, kill Nemesis, grab first part of the Desert Eagle. When he comes through the window, get the second part. After that, that's the only two bits that I kept doing the same. Everything else, I was like, right, let's do the opposite. So I'll go to the restaurant first, not the press office. I will, when the restaurant happens, I'll jump in the basement and climb out rather than throwing the gas thing and blowing him up that way, which I've also done before in the past. All these other different beats. Everything I tried to do the exact opposite way, and still my boy Nikolai died, and I was very sad. And it made me very sad. And but anyway, the real one that I want to talk to you guys about, and sorry, to answer the question, yes, I love it. More of this, please. The one that I don't get, the one that I swear happened, and bear in mind, this is a very, very old memory, so you guys will know immediately. I swear the very first time through I played this, which was the Japanese version many, many years ago, I encountered the Gravedigger in the garage. The bit where you kind of come around the corner and then the crate starts sliding towards you, you drop down. Drop down. Gravedigger is down there. Have that whole sequence down there with Gravedigger. When you climb up the ladder, you come up through the garage bit that is literally next to where the hole is, rather than the manhole cover outside. Is that a thing you can achieve in this game? So I've never once seen it outside of that. Yeah,
you drop down when the thing's going to throw some crates out of the back of a lorry at you, and you'll find a dead Gravedigger's corpse.
No, so I remember the actual Gravedigger fight being down there.
Oh.
And then when you climb out, rather than coming out the manhole cover out where the mercenary is dead, you actually come up inside the garage still, but in this big, through the main gate bit that's next to where the hole is.
It's so weird because I always climb up because in my mind to avoid the Gravedigger fight. I know, and then I'll get to it later, but I think, I don't want to fight the Gravedigger if I drop down there. So it is weird you say that, but I don't know if I'm just misplacing a section of the game as well.
Yeah, it may well be that this is a weird hallucination that I've had, or a mismemory that my marine has just invented for me. But I swear that was on the first version of the playthrough we had. That's what it was. To the point where I even made it. So on my most recent playthrough, where I was like, right, let's do the press office last, so that way I've got all the items. I've gone back and put all of the items in the thing. So literally, this is my last run through the city to see if that's what triggers it, because normally I do the press office first. Nope. So, no idea. No idea whatsoever.
I mean, stuff like the openness of it and all these choices it kind of feeds into that late 90s video game rumour mill. Says, if you do this, you get this, you can unlock this. It's a secret scene. And I guess Resident Evil 3 probably had a bunch of those associated with it as well, hallucinations or otherwise. But that is the beauty of games with this kind of amount of choice, especially at the time, pre-internet as well. It's you could believe that stuff was out there because you would talk to your friend and they had a completely different experience than you did, which also makes Resident Evil 3 great because if we sat down together and played it and, one of us watched the other play it, you'd be like, oh, this is really interesting that you do it this way. Or, oh, I never get to see this scene, even though it's totally natural for the other person.
Yeah. It's slightly anecdotal, but will amuse you. And it is not Resident Evil. I remember a very long time ago, around the time when Mortal Kombat came out on the SNES, that one of the games magazines, I forget which one, ran... you know this one? Literally ran an April Fool's joke, which involved you taping...
Two guys in the background.
Sorry?
Is this the two guys in the background?
The guys in the background, also you taping a penny to the top of the machine, the cartridge, because that way it fooled the weight of the thing to thinking it was the NTSC version, which was heavier. So all these people just went and did it, and then the next magazine, no, that was an April Fool's joke, guys. Stop taking coins to the stop of your game.
That's amazing. And you know what's extra hilarious about that is that in prep for this podcast, I thought, I'm going to listen back to our original Resident Evil 3 podcast. And Adam tells a story about Street Fighter rumour where Ryu would punch out the top of his screen. If you do this, you can get Ryu to punch out vertically out of the TV. So that is incredible. The both podcasts on RE3 we've done. And there's been a fighting game weird rumour. And that's amazing.
But as you say, that was the 90s. That was the 90s of video games. That's what it was.
KDB, how do you feel about the randomness, the openness, the replayability of Nemesis?
It's so spot on, like, because there's no YouTube or anything back then. You couldn't look up and watch it for yourself. You hear about, you know, the Barry cutscene and you're like, what? No, you're lying. You didn't see that.
Only one of 3 endings, isn't it? So,
exactly. Like, I thought my best friend was just winding me up. You know, this character that we loved from Resident Evil 1. He's like, oh, yeah, no, I got Barry at the end. And I just thought he was just lying. And there's no way for me to verify it. I didn't have the internet to check. There's no YouTube or anything like that. It's just, this kind of stuff is, like I've mentioned it, it's these bold, off-the-leash things that the devs have done which catch you off guard. The fact you're kind of hit with these, you know, the live selection, you're hit with the decision of facing basically a boss within the first few minutes of the game that the whole entire first game leads up to you fighting. You know, this is the slow build isn't there. The first of the second games, you're just, it throws it at you right away, and it demands that you explore the game, you explore its openness. And just playing it again recently, like, I think, like, the press office, the Carlos in the press office, like, I think I've maybe got that once in my life, and I've always get him in the restaurant, but I got him in the press office this time, and I don't know what I did to get that. I don't know what I did differently, but I love that it happened. And, you know, by doing that, I didn't get a certain character interaction that is the most famous one. And it's just, yeah, it's kind of astounding that, and you talked about the other characters from RE2 side, what this game lacks in a second disc and a second main character, it makes up for with all this stuff, with the optional pathways and the live selection and the randomness. And I've said it a couple of times already, just the more I play it and the more I think about it, I think every time I revisit this game, I have a new appreciation for that stuff and what it's doing. And there's like a big problem I do have with this game, which we're going to get to. But in spite of that, like, all this stuff is awesome, and this openness is, and there's not too much to add to what everyone else has said, because, it's just, I think we're all pretty much on the same page. Just the mythical stuff, we've talked about the mythical stuff, and I just, it still hits home today, playing it like 30 years later nearly.
Yep, and there's way more of it than I think that people realise, or I think people take for granted or downplay it. Because as we talk, I just think of more and more of them. You know, Murphy Seeker, you can either find him already dead, or you can find him being shot, already a zombie and having to be shot. And Tyrell Patrick as well has 2 different scenes, and I think those are all dependent on where you go and when you go there. Like in the hospital, if you go to a certain floor before another one, I'm pretty sure I always wind up with Tyrell blowing himself up, but that's not necessarily always the case, I think. Just stuff like that where it's like, and Mikhail, for example, and we talked about this in the original episode, we're back in season 1. If you go back, Steve, is this right? If you go back to the tram whilst you're collecting the items but you haven't got them all, that's when you get the scene where he either throws a grenade or blows up enemies with a barrel, or stuff like that, where it's just like, you could potentially see that on playthrough 5 or 6, not your first one, depends on what you do, or maybe even never. And stuff like that is really cool and makes you want to go back through and be like, I've heard that this exists, I'm going to go and see this for myself.
And that's also where we can probably give a shout out to the epilogue system as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because by playing it through multiple times, you do get to see the fate, as it was at the time, of these characters. How's Hunk doing? Oh, eating tofu. Cool. Like, how's what's happening with Claire? What's happening with Jill? Well, she goes on a cruise and everything's good. Okay, great. These sort of various different things that happen. Like, that was a big driver at the time of got to go back. In the time before we had achievements in games, Resident Evil 3 was saying, hey, come back, play me some more, because you're going to unlock stuff. And that's all encouraging. That's all encouraging you to experience the randomness.
Yeah, this is absolutely right. Yeah, learn about characters from the other games that you might well have played, because you're a fan of the series now, 3 games deep, so you're somewhat invested in what's going on here. It's a really good incentive, because, again, pre-internet, you couldn't necessarily look up these epilogue pictures. You would have to work through them for yourself to find out what happened to. Yeah, all these different characters. Absolutely.
But what happened to Rebecca Chambers' side? You have to beat the game 10 times for that, is it? Or...
See, apparently the scene for that is at the end of Remake 3, you know.
Oh, right.
She's wearing green, so it's Rebecca, but it's probably not. It's probably no one. It's probably nothing, because it's never going to get followed up again, because it's Resident Evil. And post-credits thingers go nowhere 100% of the time.
Deary me.
Got to be real there for a second. And now, reading the file Supervisor's Report from Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, Joe Johnston, who you can follow on Blue Sky at JJ Pinwheel.
Supervisor's Report. The endurance ability of the contaminated guinea pigs is truly incredible. Even when shot in a vital area, they can sometimes survive for several days without taking care of the wound. However, after prolonged exposure to the virus, the guinea pig's intelligence level decreases to that of an insect. Even though reviving the dead seems too disgusting, the virus may still be of use. If we inject the virus into our POWs and release them, they would return to their units and then turn into zombies. This plan may work well for us in the future. In certain areas, the virus seems to have caused the mutation of animals and plants. It may be difficult, but it'll make a good sample for the bioweapon development. I've heard that there is a giant alligator, but I have only encountered that giant creature moving underground. I don't even want to imagine what creature spawned that monster. I encountered Nemesis. If I didn't know about it, I'd have been contaminated and would have become one of them by now. If it is still walking around in the city, its mission is not yet over. STAR's members must be very tough, since they have survived until this point. However, they cannot hold out forever.
Let's talk about visuals and audio and general aesthetics, as we are wont to do. Kelsey, I'm going to start with you. How do you feel about the way that Resident Evil 3 looks and sounds? And we've done a lot of talking about context at the time. Did you feel like this is enough of a departure from Resident Evil 2 to give it enough of identity? Because I did mention that there is, I'd say, and more crossover between 2 and 3, obviously, identifiably similar games. 1 to 2, huge step up. 2 and 3, at first glance, less so. But did you think this game carves enough of its own identity out?
Yeah, it does, for a couple of reasons. And like you said there, at first glance, maybe you think, it just looks the same. It doesn't look the same. I think, although it's more of the same technique, it's this... mix of the pre-rendered and the 3D models and stuff. It's kind of as good as ever, really. And I think they do pack so much in. And this is obviously, I guess this is the swan song of that for RE, right? They didn't use pre-rendered again after this, or am I imagining? Let's just consult Steve.
There's two titles called the remake and RE0, but
of course, yeah. Of course.
Small things no one really talks about anymore.
On PS1, let's say on PS1.
Dino Crisis 2 would be the last Capcom pre-rendered game.
But my point I was going to get to
Steve and I are both
that,
judging you, by the way, right now.
Listen, it's late. I'm tired, and it's nearly Christmas. I think here you really do get your money's worth. Like there's even more like visual storytelling in this than there is in RE2. The shops in the streets are all really good. I think there's so many dead bodies in this game. It's ridiculous. And there's a lot of, files on dead bodies because it's a lot of people caught up in, the city falling apart. And there's some horrifically brutal, and quite unsettling visual storytelling in the pre-rendered background. So it is, of course, odd to see the streets of Japan in what's supposed to be American Midwestern city. But, aside from that, the game has those strong visuals that sell it as its own thing, because there's so many new parts that we've never seen before. And you think of the clock tower, the hospital, and then even really incidental places like places we've mentioned, the bar, the pharmacy, the gas station we haven't talked about, even the dead factory where stuff can get a bit sort of just, sort of grungy and samey. I think you can see like the dead tyrants and the dead BOWs. There's so much visual storytelling in this technique that they're using again. It's all diverse. The locations are incredibly diverse, and it's just the game does so much for adding to that Raccoon City that I think, again, we maybe take for granted how much this game has added to it when you compare it to Resident Evil 2. So yeah, it's awesome, and the character models and BOWs are a step up. They have more detail, and that just sort of does wonders for the immersion and making it feel alive. So yeah, it's at first glance, like you said, you think, oh, it's just the same as Resident Evil 2. It's not. There's loads more in here, and it is fantastic.
I played the GOG version when I did my recent replay, because why the heck not? I don't think I've ever played the PC version, so thought I would give that a go. So other than just using the unique PC costume, which was nice, I also was treated to, I think, some upscaled backgrounds here and there. Some that have been given a nice little bit of extra work, or were not compressed like the PS1 were. Some are really ropey compared to the PS1, but some are way cleaner, and some camera angles that you only see like for a split second in cutscenes as well that were really nice. So I spent a lot of time on this playthrough really appreciating that visual storytelling, even right down to, you know, the posters and the adverts and stuff just posted up all around the city, and the advertising and stuff like that is just really cool to look at and gives you a really good sense of place, even if the city, yes, absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. It is still nice to have that level of detail to make you think about that. I can't see how it would be lived in. That makes no sense to me. How would you ever get around? How does anyone ever get to work around here? But like all the little details that make you think, oh, you know, there were people here and they've all died or whatever. And yeah, all the bodies and the notes on top of that. And yeah, I mean, you can't talk about visual storytelling and backgrounds in Resident Evil 3 without mentioning the dead factory and all the dead tyrants and stuff like that. It's super cool. And on the audio side of things, I think, having listened to our last Resident Evil 3 podcast, we were unduly unfair on a Resident Evil 3 soundtrack. I think we all, at the time, kind of poo-pooed it just a little bit. We were like, it's not one of the better ones. I don't know if it is one of the better ones, but we really it deserved more of a shout out for what it does. And we've talked about this a lot throughout. Now, that's what I call survival horror over the last few years, in terms of a lot of Resident Evil games have their own identity in terms of the soundtrack. They have their leitmotifs and they have certain types of instrumentation. So Resident Evil 3's sort of militaristic snare drum stuff throughout the soundtrack's really, really cool. That like dun 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 that I hadn't even noticed is like a recurring thing until really the remake, where it's really right in your face and you go, oh yeah, this was all over the original soundtrack, and it's just dotted in a way that you don't necessarily think about it as much. And obviously, shout out, it has like most people's favourite or one of their favourite save room themes, and everyone here tonight loves City of Ruin. If not, leave the call now, you know. Sherwin, how do you feel about the soundtrack and the visuals of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis?
I'm glad. Was I on the original RE3 podcast?
You were not.
Yeah, that's right, because I would have been going to like super hype WrestleMania mode promo level if you were insulting the soundtrack near me. The Resident Evil 3 has probably the best. It's definitely in the top 3 soundtracks in the entire series. Nice. It's literally that. It's possibly second. The first is Zero, which is so unique and so interesting. It diverges so weirdly and wonderfully so from everything else. But this one is just so good. And I think there is a point where it's not crazy divergent from 2. What's really telling there is some of the RPD themes, which are the same, First Floor and so on, they fit neatly alongside. And they're like a familiar old friend or whatever else. So this isn't something where it has like in its own completely different kind of, oh wow, that's so different. It's it's not Resident Evil 0 where it's non-instrumental noise. It's made from a similar place, but it still manages to keep its own sense of uniqueness. It still is its own entity. It's still fresh, but it's done in a way that again feels organically like, okay, I'm in the same place. There's a lot of continuity there, which is obviously, which is exactly what you want from it. And the actual themes, as you've said, City of Ruin is utterly chef's kiss, and so are the various other different bits as well. It's got the best ending sequence, like I am ready to go fight the world listening to that thing. Like it's absolutely amazing. I think that the visuals wise, I mean, yeah, we've talked a lot about it, and I agree with your 80s wrestling figures versus 2000s wrestling figures analogy about the posable limbs and stuff, and the kung fu grips. But I think it's the continuity, it's the small bits of continuity as well as the visual storytelling, which I think I want to talk a bit about. Like, it's stuff which is like nods to other things in the series. There's the DeLorean at the garage, which obviously ties back to the Back to the Future picture in RE2 in the Star's office. There's the same poster that's also in the garage, actually, which is also in RE2 and RE1. There's actually a poster that's on the wall of like the girl in the bikini or whatever else, which is clearly like a thing where you're like, so, and you could imagine at the time that's like a random thing that would have been in, I don't know, like whatever men's magazine, FHM or whatever at the time, and thus, boom, 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 it appears all over the place, that kind of stuff. Like, it's various different things like that that are callbacks, and you could go, that's just lazy programming, but it's not. It's not where they went, we've already got this asset, let's stick it on there, because of the way these backgrounds are made. It's not like you just lift it and drop it. It is something where they've put that in with a sense of, no, this is happening at the same time. So thus you would see the same effects here and there. Things that were popular for, this thing would still be popular in these places. There's loads of small nods here and there to Resident Evil, which, to the other two games, which are really, really important and really make it, again, feel like it is a Resident Evil game. It's set in the same universe. It's really tight in terms of how together and cohesive this feels like. In some ways, this actually almost goes back a little bit and actually sort of ties the other two previous games together for me. Not only in terms of the presence of Jill, but also in terms of those small details.
I also just want to throw it in here, this is somewhat relevant and specifically to me talking about what we talked about before 5 years ago. I do somewhat stand by the fact that I think the Drain Demos and the Brain Suckers are very much the sort of poor man's version of the Chimera. But my recent playthrough, I don't know if it was because of the PC version, I don't know if it was because I was sitting closer to the screen, I have no idea. But this time I actually managed to discern the visible difference between the two. I could tell which one was the brown one and which one was the squiggly green one. I wish there was more to them than that, but I think we hated on them a lot before, and I just wanted to give them the shout out this time. It's a shame. Ferdinand in the live chat, they lay eggs. They absolutely do. Talking about the randomness of it, I don't think I've ever seen it in my playthrough, but I know that it exists. That they can have baby demos, which is really, really cool. But there you go. I guess a visual touch. I like the visual design of them, much like I love the Chimeras. I just kind of wish there was more to them in the game. But anyway, Steve, how do you feel about the aesthetics of Nemesis?
Generally speaking, I'm on board with what everyone's saying, but I will argue it's probably still the weakest soundtrack of the PS1 trilogy. Don't fight me, I still like it. I just like one or two more. I appreciate more. I said this earlier about the model rigging work, especially, and I just want to shout out a few. Like, how many games can you up the power in a power station and decapitate like 8 zombies at once, and it looks believably cartoonish in just the right sickening kind of way? Or the way you have to melt Nemesis and the way that he's convincingly like mouth agape as he's being showered in acid. It's surprisingly complex when you look at, like, for example, RE1 and a zombie kind of lurches awkwardly as it's blasted with a shotgun. It's diegetic is not the right word. That's sound, but for visual polygonal models is it's pretty good. It's pretty good, and when it comes to the actual score, it's Resident Evil 3 always feels very sorrowful and mournful, unless it's like Nemesis's presence, in which case then it's trying to be putting you on edge or amp your tension. Whereas I feel like 3 and 1 had more atmospheric tracks as opposed to trying to set a mood. So for that, I'll give 3 the having a mood more consistently throughout the game. I'll give it that. You can have those props. You also had gammas in a fish tank. Very nice, very nice. Never again. Never again will I see a hunter decapitate a zombie and screech at me the same way, because they normally do take Carlos's head straight off.
Yeah, they do.
Straight comment, by the way, when you talk about how can you have a hunter decapitate a zombie that doesn't decapitate a zombie? Also brilliant. Censorship
of the GameCube version. But no, generally speaking, it's mechanically sound, and like others have said, the the level of detail, it's a step above. Is it as sophisticated as something on the system, like, say, for a fighting game? No, but it doesn't have to be. It conveys the emotion better than 2 or 1 did. I'm fine with it. It's the same as I said last time, Si. It's good, just not as good as the other 2.
That's fine. And I think you've actually said something there that I really appreciate in terms of, we talk a lot, again, when we talk about music in survival horror, and about that sort of sorrowful mood in a lot of horror music, in a lot of Resident Evil that comes to mind, but it's not in a lot of Resident Evil. It's specifically in Resident Evil 3. Like, I think of survival horror music often having kind of a sad twinge to it, and it's here and there throughout. But Resident Evil 3 absolutely brings to the forefront. You're absolutely right. It somehow kind of marries this militaristic action movie sound also with largely it being a mournful soundtrack. So yeah, that vibe I really gel with. And also, you talk about decapitating zombies. We need to shout out, you and I talked about this because I played this recent playthrough on the Discord server. The zombie models in this, not necessarily memorable like RE2 and RE1. It's because they're like randomized as well, my understanding. They're like, I think the best we can tell is just like bits and bobs of models put together every time. Different heads and bodies and legs. So like the sheer degree of customization in the zombies, as you were, like that you can see as you wander around the city, is really cool. Makes the hordes look really different. I love the zombies in RE3. They've really, I don't know if I would have said that once upon a time, but
they
they've
have
really
body
grown
types,
on me.
don't they? Like, you also have fat zombies. You also have, I think, more than one lady zombie type.
I was going to say, yeah.
You know, it's not just Misty representing the entirety of a gender.
Yeah, so it's again, everything comes back to the sort of randomness of RE3 in a good way, and that's another one for it there as well. Let's talk about story as well before we get on to the remake. How we feel about Resident Evil 3's story. Where does it sort of rank among the best of the stories for you at this point, now that we have a remake to compare it to in the sort of wider web of Resident Evil? Kelsey, how do you feel about the tale of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis?
So this is the bit that doesn't rank highly for me, to be honest. I think the game does loads for like world building and the setting and gap filling, but I think it does that through just kind of playing it, and as I've mentioned, the pre-rendered backgrounds and stuff like that, and some of the files. I think the story that plays out in the game is fine. It's just quite thin. There's hardly any characters, and it's all kind of too brief, and it's very hard to it's got some big shoes to fill with, I think, the previous 2 games. I don't dislike it. I've got nothing against this very self-contained, how do we escape sort of road trip through Raccoon City, but the character interactions are so few and far between that it's very difficult for me to be as emotionally invested. And I think I remember on the RE2 podcast, it was either Sherwin or Berger that said that the story in that game does what it needs to do and it's serviceable. But for me, this is how I feel about RE3's story. And I think, if anything, I'd probably be even more harsh, because when you think about the cutscenes, there's some of the dialogue between the characters I think is a huge step back from what RE2 was doing. It feels like sometimes they had very limited time to play with the cutscenes. It feels like they're missing a few sentences. Some of it ends way too abruptly, and it feels quite rushed through. Now, of course, you do have all the different, you can have different interactions, and there's, like 2 versions of meeting a character or 2 versions of a character dying, but any scenario you encounter, there's not much going on apart from Jill. Like, Jill's really good, and I didn't touch on this in the previous section, but like the voice acting, I think, in this game overall, aside from Jill, is also a huge step back from RE2. I think Jill's voice actor is awesome and the best thing, the best of all of them in this game. But it just feels quite rushed through, and I think there's none of that incredible interweaving of multiple story threads. Instead, they're kind of interweaving incredible gameplay in RE3. And so there's none of the family stuff of RE2 or the more interesting kind of conspiracy reveal of RE1. RE3 is more sort of function over feeling for me, and I do love playing the game, but it is very much more a sort of gameplay focused experience without the epic narrative of RE1 and 2 that really, you know, along with the combination of the gameplay, got me invested in the franchise in the first place. So it's not bad. It's just, I just think it's, of everything we've talked about today, I think it's the thinnest thing on the ground. And the files add lots here and there. There's loads of new lore and stuff, and the pre-rendered backgrounds and the environmental storytelling, as I've mentioned. But then there's also like, there's these really wasted files where it's just stills from the intro and it says like zombies walking and stuff like that, which really annoys me. And I feel like they could have done more there. So again, I don't know if this is a time thing and it's just they have to pick and choose their battles when making a game, and there were certain cutscenes that couldn't be extended, certain conversations that couldn't be extended. Characters literally, I think Carlos on multiple occasions just runs away from Jill and stops talking, and it's like, I don't know, it just, I think story-wise, yeah, it's so fast-paced, it's so lightning fast, there's not really much going on. It happens over the course of a few hours, so it's fine, it does what it needs to do, it's serviceable, but it just pales in comparison to anything that came before.
You are hysterically right that it happens over the course of a few hours, despite the fact that, like, in the middle there's a couple of days where nothing happens.
Well, yeah.
That's very funny. But you're right, because otherwise the actual parts where you're in control, it is literally a couple of hours either side. I think, actually, I'm inclined to agree, but with the caveat that, for me, the sort of humongous amount of new lore kind of makes up for it.
Sure.
Like, the most damning sort of thing for me, or not, sort of depending on your perspective, is that the whole thing about the UBCS and the supervisors is revealed in a file, and you don't really get any of it in the cutscene. You do get a little bit. Yeah. Like afterwards, Jill accuses Nikolai and all this or whatever, and they have a bit of a standoff. But the game kind of relies on you having read the file and understood what's going on. It doesn't actually outright tell you. And obviously, your taste may vary. Show, don't tell. Tell, don't show. I want to learn it myself, whatever. You don't have to outright spell it out. I'm not an idiot. But it does feel like it kind of goes one way rather than finds a happy medium. There isn't a lot going on in terms of the story, you're right. And that's, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I absolutely get your point about being its weakest strength. What does that even mean?
I've said
its
before,
least strong point.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's just like I'm completely with you, and you're right. And like some of the files are really long in this game, and it says loads of stuff. And some of the best character stuff are in the files with there's like the soldier protecting the girl, and there's I think there's somebody in the lab as well. That stuff is really good, but it's sort of
Doctor as well.
I get frustrated, and the newer games do this a lot, and Village does this a lot. It chucks so much into files, and it's just like, cool. That's cool that lore is there, but in terms of playing the game and the story playing out in the game, I want more stuff. I want these people that I'm looking at and hearing speak and sort of controlling. I want more to hang on to there, and there's not a great deal of characters in this game, and they do have an impact. They do leave an impact in various ways, but sometimes maybe sort of in more memey ways than I would want them to. So I just
I've got one for you then. If we're doing controversies, having replayed this recently, I think people have lionized Mikhail way too much in the original Nemesis. He frankly is just a nothing character.
100%.
And you get he's just like there, and he's like, oh, I'm reliving a battle or whatever, and you're like, oh, that's quite sad, but I don't really know this guy. And then he blows up some zombies optionally if you go back at the right time.
Yeah.
And then he blows up Nemesis. But you don't really get to know anything about him or whatever. Like, you get way more out of, and we'll talk about the remake in a bit, but you get way more out of the opening scene with him in the remake. Again, I think you're right in terms of, because it started off as a spin-off perhaps, the focus was on the gameplay and not enough time was put into the story, and I think that is obviously why there's almost no FMVs. The FMVs that we did get are sensational. I think there's only two? Actually, no, three. I think there's three. The opening cutscene, Brad dying, and the clock tower. I think that might be it in terms of full motion video.
Hospital.
The gas station.
Hospital.
Petrol station.
Oh yeah, and the hospital. Okay, so there's a couple of short
nuclear
ones.
blast.
Is that... I guess it is an FMV. I was thinking of it as stills, but yeah, you're right. You do. Okay, there's a few more than I think, but still, I do wonder if that, cutscenes and voice recording was maybe impacted by the fact that it's a spin-off, and also because they needed to record alternate takes for different locations and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it is a shame that the minor characters in this largely only get a couple of lines each. Sherwin, how do you feel about the story, the lore, and the characters of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis? I'm sorry to have betrayed your love of Mikhail.
That's fine. What Mikhail and I have is very special. I don't expect everyone to understand it. It's fine. I still say the greatest Resident Evil game that was never made is the Barry and Mikhail tag team. That would be amazing.
Yeah. I would buy it.
Everyone would buy it. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I think I can 100% see where you're coming from, KDB. I think for me, if I think way back to playing Resident Evil for the first time, so much of the Resident Evil experience is understanding what went wrong if you're in the first game, or like first game, I've been dumped in a mansion filled with zombies. What's happening? I need to discover what's and so much of it is discovering the story of what's happening as you go through. And that's why Remake was such a success, because it added a whole new element to that with Lisa Trevor and other bits. The second one, how did the virus get to the city? What's happened? Like, trying to understand how that works and so on. There's various different points which are really interesting in the game where you are trying to uncover what it is, and that's, you can't separate that from the experience of actually playing it as well, because that's part of the horror of it, right? Is reading these accounts of people slowly turning into zombies or trying to survive, or understanding this experience of, oh wait, so that's why Ada's here. No one knows why Ada's here, but that's what Annette's thing is, or that's who Sherry is, that kind of stuff, right? None of that is in Resident Evil 3. That's completely divorced. But then at the same time, that's because it would have felt, I think, disingenuous to try and do that, because everyone knows, well, she's in Raccoon City. It's gone to hell in a handbasket. We should get out. Like, I don't think there's capacity to do that storytelling. If you tried to put like a big mystery that Jill's trying to solve while she's in there, it would have detracted from the, oh no, I need to get out of the zombie-infested city or I get eaten. I think there's a big part of that. If you'd had like a Nemesis Origins kind of story in there, then I think that would have not felt correct. Like, I think what you've got is kind of a very brief kind of run through of you are finding the harrowing reality of what happened in Raccoon City, and it's almost like you switch the lights on now. Instead of like knowing Raccoon City is bad, now I get to see how bad it was, and seeing all the reading the reports in the notes of people trying to survive or just trying to get through and ultimately ending their lives, or trying to fight a horde of zombies or whatever else. Big shout out to the guy who uses a grenade as a melee weapon in the open F&B, by the way. Love that guy. But yeah, like, it's stuff like that where it's interesting to read and go through, but I don't think it could conceivably be more. That said, I definitely agree with you in terms of the dialogue is ultimately rooted in the 90s, right? Like, some of the stuff that Carlos says make you cringe. Some of the, whilst I'm not going to disagree with you, I do think Jill's voice actress is very good. Like, she actually conveys a lot more emotion than what you might have expected in some of the other games, or you might have been used to. Like, I don't think she's the right fit for the game. Like,
sure. Interesting.
Like, I'm not sure that's like, she just sounds in times, and this part of this is the visuals as well. Jill just feels more upbeat than she should do. She should be more battle hardened, more like, I need to get out of this place. Like, sometimes she just sounds positively kind of like quite vanilla in this thing, and you're like, you've already survived a Resident Evil lab. Like, you've seen some pretty harrowing stuff. Nothing what you're seeing here should be a surprise, kind of stuff. That sort of thing. I think. So yeah, I do think, considering what they had to work with, like, I think Nikolai is perfectly fine. Like, but again, it is rooted in that sense of, it is the 90s. The rules were different then. You didn't have that quite same push to go and get the same out of your voice actors as you did. So, but yeah, I think Resident Evil 3 does a decent enough job of telling it. As we've already said, there's loads of visual storytelling happening. I think one thing that it does do very, very well is that it kind of gives the players an objective, and it doesn't deviate from that. It's like, our objective is get out. We don't know how we're getting out. The constant thing is trying to get from point A to point B. We don't know where point B is, but we know we want to get there, and we're just trying to go. And bearing in mind it's an open city, I think it's almost quite important to have that, because you have that overriding kind of focus that kind of keeps the player in the game rather than just wandering and I don't even know where I am, what I'm supposed to be doing or anything else. That happened with some people playing in the mansion or playing in the police station. Nobody on this podcast, and probably no one listened to this podcast, but I spoke to plenty of people over the years who were saying, I liked Resident Evil, but I had to say, why not just walk out of the police building? Like, why am I wandering around this police building when I find all these zombies? Why don't I just go out into the streets and escape? And it's almost like you sigh and you go, I can't bother to have this conversation with you. But like, it's that kind of thing. Like Resident Evil 3 is, I'm outside in the streets. So you need something that keeps you going, okay, I'm trying to get out. And it just, there is that purity of focus, which I think is very important for Resident Evil 3. And I think definitely that's what the story gives you by keeping that pace going. And that's pretty much.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the pacing of the game. The only time that it really deviates from that objective, like you mentioned there, is basically get the vaccine for Jill so we can continue to escape. And it's placed at the right point of the game for me in terms of you've done that big open section, and now we need to take a bit of a breather. Well, I guess you do the clock tower first as well, just a tiny little hub, and you take a bit of a breather. It's really nicely paced, and then it sort of rocket skates on towards the end of the game. I always forget how quickly you speed through the park and Dead Factory towards the end, sort of ramping up to those final boss fights. So I'm a big fan of the pace of the game, and of the length, I think, as well. I guess it's worth throwing in here as well. Having been able to play it recently in an afternoon, essentially, and being really happy with that. As we talked about earlier about the replayability, it's like, I want to go back in now and play it again. Steve, how do you feel about the story, the characters, the lore, and so on of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis?
Oh, God. Like, we live in a post-Remake 3 world, and my brain is like a marriage mishmash. In terms of the 3 on the PS1, it's fine. It's probably the most coherent, and no offense to RE1 Jill, but RE3 Jill is an actual character as opposed to the Jillbot 9000 with all the emotions of a brick. Sorry, everybody, not to break it, but she was the poorest voice actress in the entirety of the thing. Whereas now she's an actual person, has a lot of weight. The first thing she does is literally try and reassure Dario screams a lot man into trying to get out of the city. It's compelling enough to her character that her first real spoken words to other people are of reassurance of being basically a heroic super cop. I like that. Catherine Dish's performance as Jill is definitely the standout. If I had some kind of twisted mishmash of this and the remake stuff, though, I probably would lean more towards Jill Tompkins. But there's something about classic Nikolai as well. That's like you're the perfect cliche Russian mercenary bad guy, and you're also still alive because I totally jump off the bridge every time. Just saying, that's how you get that ending showing. Yeah,
Really? Because I've done that a bunch of times and never. Oh, fine. I'll go back and play again. If that's how you do it, then I swear that. Good, thank you. I want my boy to survive. If you hadn't worked out, whilst Mikhail was cool, Nikolai is the best Resident Evil villain ever.
He lives on in canon until he's confirmed dead for me too.
Yeah, agreed.
We need a villain that comes back, and it might as well be him. But I'm getting sidetracked. Carlos is fine. Mikhail is okay. He's better than, for example, like a red shirt of a red shirt. You at least get the idea that he's been through some trauma and that he does take one for the team and save the day. But he also does literally nothing else. It's just a bit of a shame. Arguably Dario has just as much of an impact on the story when you go back and say, oh, look, he tried to get out and he died. What a wally. Unlike RE3 remake Dario, who obviously survived the entire thing and jumped out of a container. Look up Toga Keegan's comics for more.
The most popular server emoji for the last 3 years.
100%. But yeah, overall as a package in the story, it's fine. I think, like Kels has said, the notes, specifically, I can get behind a depressed mercenary trying to, compartmentalize their thoughts near the end of their life or expected end of their life. And there was a hell of a lot of those in this game. The horrors that the UBCS go through, I feel like they deserve their own game going through the horrors of it, and not like some kind of heroic soldier shooting thing. No, that they the Spec Ops, the line of Resident Evil games. I was about to say
Spec Ops or the end of Halo Reach.
Yeah. That level of bleakness throughout all of their notes, and it's wonderful in the worst possible way.
I tried, Steve. Capcom wouldn't let me do it.
Yeah, RE3 board game. Oh,
what could have been.
Yeah.
I think for my sort of negative remarks on some of the characters, they at least do serve the overall tone of the game, which is that all hope is gone.
Yeah.
It's time to get out because we're all screwed otherwise. So, yes.
I mean, even RE2 standout David Ford, even RE2 standout David Ford gets another file. Admittedly, he sounds like he's also on the same level of depression wavelength as the Mercenaries this time. It's more of this.
Indeed. Okay, last point before we close this up. Let's talk about the remake a little bit more. It's been touched on a little bit throughout this podcast, but yes, we are now 5 years, nearly, I'd say 4.5 years at the time of recording, actually, away from 5 years of the remake. But I can't even get my words out. I'm just so aghast that it was that long ago already, because people to this day still critique the remake very strongly. I think as its own game, obviously we've kind of come to bat for it. But obviously, being that it is meant to be a remake or a reimagining, depending on the wording you'd like, it's definitely worth having that conversation in terms of how you feel they stack up against each other. What's your preferred version of events or preferred game to play? Do you feel the need to compare them at all, in fact? And do you think that it was a good way to remake the game, or would you have liked something that was more faithful? Because, yes, as I mentioned earlier, the way that the whole getting the tram online is completely different and also over in about 45 seconds. Steve, how do you feel about the original game versus the remake after all this time?
I'm going to posit a question more, like, how would your ideal version of both these two games have played? And for me, the remake of 3, if it had taken the openness specifically of the section, fixing the tram, of the original and made Raccoon City a little bit more, as we described, a more open environment with Nemesis to be. I mean, I've talked about how Nemesis is like, he's got all these moves and he can barely use them in Remake 3. If that was actually a thing, Scorsese gif of absolute cinema or absolute gaming, that would have been fantastic. Being stalked by Nemesis in an open city to try and solve the puzzle, as opposed to basically a linear assault course, which is fun. It allows the story to have structure, and we also even get a great introductory scene with Carlos saving the day with his rocket launcher. excuse me, and introducing us to the UBCS. We even get that little bit with Brad that we don't get in the original, which is very nice. But the original game has so much more going for it in terms of what you can do, player agency, and what happens and the outcome. Sure, combat is better in the remake, but you also have mechanical skills that you can use in the original to make it just as satisfying of doing a dodge that somehow charges a zombie, you pull your shotgun up and take 3 heads off. It's, again, Scorsese gif, absolute cinema. So it's finding the middle road, which unfortunately doesn't exist, so we have to separate the two. There are pieces missing in Remake 3 that obviously upset a lot of people, like the amount of times I've heard the save the clock tower,
Yeah.
And
I didn't want to mention it, but I mean,
yeah. The park, the hospital is arguably different. I prefer the new hospital, but I can understand why people would prefer the one that's more a la the one in Outbreak. Yeah, it's a lose-lose situation comparing the two for me, because there are things I like about it in both. That being said, if I had to choose between some random staffers who we don't know, or the whole Dr. Bard subplot, and hell, even maybe not the idea overall of Nest 2, but an Umbrella Lab as opposed to an Umbrella dumping site, or a more run-down Umbrella Lab, I would have been all for it. Yeah, it's not easy for me to dissociate them. If I had to literally go, right, pick one, I'm going with the original, because it's just got that much more content richness and I can put much more of a spin on it. But there is so many things in 3 Remake that I could see just like, oh, this would be perfect. But it isn't. So I'm going to have to live in a cold, cruel, Carlos's world.
Yeah, it's a shame, really, because I think it is so far along the sort of track to what I wanted that game to be. Just a little more time into it. Having played a little bit of it recently again, I've just arrived at the sewers, and I'm probably going to finish that playthrough off. But I have kind of finished the best bit now, you're right, in terms of the Nemesis stuff. He's absolutely kicked my butt from uptown to downtown over and over again, because I haven't played it in so long. And I've loved it. It's been great. having to grapple with it and having to get good at the dodge again. The dodge that actually works as opposed to the one from 1999. And that's been cool. And it's a shame that there isn't going to be any more of that in the game. And I'm kind of, until the final boss now, I guess I'm kind of done with the difficulty aspect of it. So much potential in that. I think Remake 3, yes, it's a great game. I love to play it. It feels great to play. So in that sense, I really have no issue picking them both up every now and then. And also in that sense, it is kind of nice that they do something different with the story. And we kind of predicted as such that this would be the one that would be the most open to reinterpretation, if you like. I have my preferences over like you. I would take a lot of the original versions of the lore, and I don't really care for the Dr. Bard stuff and like stuff like that. But from a gameplay perspective, it's kind of much of a muchness for me, and I'm kind of happy that they are different in that sense. Even though I guess have a preference. Sherwin, how do you feel about Remake 3 as it stands, compared to the original at this point?
I mean, I enjoyed Resident Evil 3 Remake, playing it. I very much went into it with an open mind and said, this is not going to be a remake of Resident Evil 3, despite the fact it is. Much like RE2, this is just a new RE3. Think of it that way. And as a result, enjoyed it. That said, it is... There are two things I think that work against it. And the first one, funnily enough, is that this game feels very much like what the original Resident Evil 3 is. Maybe it's perfect in that sense, actually, which is that it kind of just feels like they took all the bits from RE2 and then they had left over and then kind of made RE3 out of it. Like, in terms of the engine, in terms of everything else, playing it just felt very much like it was DLC for RE2. Remake, that is, obviously.
Yeah.
That's my chief kind of... The thing that really stood out to me. And then playing RE3 Nemesis again as a refresher and listening to you guys today, I kind of landed on another point solidified in my head, which is I think one of the reasons that I'm not a bigger RE3 remake fan is because it's kind of devoid of all the really cool stuff we're talking about that RE3 Nemesis did.
That's very true.
In the sake of RE3 Remake is a very linear game. It is very straightforward. It's very, very linear game. It's very straightforward. It doesn't do that unpredictable kind of... It doesn't do the randomized thing. It doesn't do the unpredictable turn up in Nemesis. Everything feels very scripted. Everything feels very focused. Like it is... It's just not celebrating the strengths of what RE3 Nemesis was. And I think that's why, for me, irrespective of how much I may have enjoyed or not enjoyed it, I think that's a barrier for me to say this was a good remake of that game.
Yeah, that's fair. It's a fair point, actually. We organically arrived to that, but you're absolutely right. As much as there's loads of criticisms about Remake 3, fair or otherwise, the most important thing that it is missing, forget the clock tower, more Nemesis, the fact that the drain demos are just kind of confined to one little area, but it is that freedom of choice, and it's really replayable. Remake 3, we've always said that it's really fun to go through it multiple times, and you've got the different difficulties and stuff like that. It's fun to play, so it's fun to get better and faster at, so it's replayable in that sense, but you are playing the same game over and over again. Kelsey, where do you come down on the original versus remake comparison at this point?
So for me, Remake 3 does a couple of things, and I think most importantly, above all, it delivers in a better way the thing that I'm most critical about the original, and that is the characters in Remake 3, in every single way, all of them are better than the original. The performances are better, they're better written, they are just more tangible, and it doesn't feel like the conversations are cut short. Remake 3 feels like a movie in parts. I've talked in the past about how it's like peak RE engine. It looks incredible. everything that Carlos says, everything that Nikolai says, everything that Mikhail says. And for the longest time, I always thought like Barry's my favorite character. He'd always been my favorite character. It wasn't until I played Remake 3 I was like, Jill's my favorite character. And in the past, it's so weird to think that I think it's always been that way, but the portrayal of Jill in the remake, the performance of Jill, and then thinking about RE1 and then the original RE3 and then Revelations, I'm like, yeah, Jill is without question my favorite character, and it is my favorite embodiment of Jill in Remake 3. The character performances, all that stuff is incredible in Remake 3. As a game, it's really fun to play. It does feel a bit like DLC. It does feel a bit arcadey. It's missing all this stuff we've talked about. That doesn't really bother me. Like, everybody gets very angry and whinges about the stuff that it's lacking, but as a video game, it's pretty awesome and it's very well made. And as you've said, Si, it's very fun. It's very replayable. It's a great game. It's just not a great remake. But does that matter? No. It just doesn't matter. And there's a whole conversation you can have about, access to versions of the game and stuff. And I get that. But take all that away. I've got Resident Evil 3 and I've got Resident Evil 3 Remake. I like them both for different reasons. If I had to pick one, I'm going to pick the original. But even 5 years later, it's funny because... So when 3 Remake came out, that's when I discovered First Aid Spray as well. So that's also, it's like got that nice little connectivity for me as well. So nice. I think what Remake 3 did is really, really cool. It's a shame it isn't this, you look at Remake, because Remake 4 for me is, I said I prefer that to the original. So it didn't do that, but that doesn't mean it's a bad experience. And talking about it today, it's like, yeah, I like playing Remake 3. I haven't played it for a while. I'm happy. I rarely go back and replay games these days because of just time constraints and stuff. And there's also so much to play. I've often thought about revisiting Remake 3 this year, and I haven't because I've actually revisited the original a couple of times. So I'm sure I will again soon. But yeah, just to circle back to my main point is the original, the character interactions and stuff that I've complained about that aren't really there for me, they're all there in the remake, and it's some of the best stuff in all this sort of new series of games that we've had. And I think they put a lot of effort into that, even Tyrell as well. It's just like it's night and day with the characters in remake and the original, so I think you have to give it its props there. Other people were just looking for recreations of all the stuff of the gameplay and all the good stuff, like Sherwin said. And I don't get me wrong, I would have loved that. I would have absolutely loved them to do that, but they didn't. It's fine. It is a bit like DLC, but that's also fine. So
yeah, I think just to jump on there, it's the worst of the remakes, of the 4 remakes we have so far, but that is not a bad statement. That's more saying the other 3 are absolutely awesome.
Yeah,
It's literally that.
Yep.
Which actually appropriately brings us to conclusions, because I guess I'll go first then. Because for a long time, when ranking the old classic Resident Evil games, I would always put Nemesis quite close to the bottom. I don't think I would ever put it right at the bottom, because Resident Evil 0 is unfortunately very flawed. But I would always put it down there. And, having played it again recently, and I have played it a few times over the last few years, even maybe not all the way through. It's one of those games that I just get kind of drawn back to playing because, and I always say, it's the one I've played the least, so I know the least about it. But I think the truth is because even though I do follow the same, wind up going the same path, it's the same thing with RE2. I boot it up and I just say, I'm going to take it nice and slow, and I wind up just trying to speedrun it. Same thing with RE3. I'm like, I'm going to do a different pathway because I know that it's there. There's so much choice out there. I just wind up doing the same thing anyway. But the point is, I keep going back to it because of all of the potential content that you could see and spend your time kind of engrossing yourself in. Anyway, to circle back to the point I'm trying to make is that I think I've been unfair on RE3 over the years, even if I haven't said that I don't think it's bad or anything. I've never said that I thought it was a bad game at all. And much like Sherwin has just said, it's just going up against some crazy competition. Like RE1 and Remake, RE2. I am, a Code Veronica defender, as everyone should know by now. So I like all of those games, so it's hard to rank all of them. But RE3 is, I think, it's going to start seeing itself move up that list. I really enjoyed my most recent playthrough, and I really want to go back into it, and I probably will over the Christmas holiday play it again. It's something about it just has really connected with me again, and it might be the wake of the remake. And to that point, I don't think it's that I think that the remake's bad and I want this more. It's just kind of to have that context and to have and enjoy both of the games. I'm just in that point now where it's, yeah, give me it all. I'm omnivorous to it all. So RE3, I think for a lot of people, they do kind of, and it's been mentioned by someone else, say that it's the other one of the PS1 games. I don't know if that seems so unfair. But it's going up against giants, you know, the one that laid the blueprint and the one that did what a lot of good sequels do by making you go, oh, RE1 feels like a proof of concept compared to this. So what could RE2 really do in terms of breaking that ceiling? Again, it's so hard to rank these games, but my God, RE3 Nemesis is a great game, I think is the point. I'm meandering around terribly. What a great game it is. And I had such fun revisiting it. Sherwin, what's your conclusion for RE3?
Do you know how all three of you have divorced my friendship over the course of this podcast? Simply put, one of you said that Barry's no longer their favourite character, one of you said the soundtrack wasn't any good, and one of you said Mikhail sucked. So I'm now about to divorce yours. Accordingly, because, RE3 is absolutely standing on the shoulders of giants. As you've said, Si. Mm-hmm. It's better than RE2. This is, yeah. Shut
up. You know what, though?
You like raccoon tea.
I did say in the podcast there's arguments that this is the better game, but let's bury those.
No, yeah,
joking.
It's fine. I mean, look, I'm not talking about this in terms of technicality, in terms of obviously the skins and everything else. You forget that stuff for obvious reasons, right? I think if I go back as an experience, I look more fondly at Resident Evil 3 than I do Resident Evil 2. I feel like there's not only more replayability, I think there's more sophistication. I think it's more compelling as an experience. I think there's more to me as a player to just dive into and to basically sink my teeth into. I think the setup pieces are better in terms of the actual way the boss fights work, in terms of the actual combat puzzles and situations you find yourself in. I think the entire thing is just much more direct. And that is not to say that RE2 is a bad game, obviously very far from it. It really isn't. But the point is that I do think in reflection, this is a stronger game.
So, point number one I'm going to make is I can't believe we didn't talk about the boss fights in this game, because they are an absolute low point. It must be said. Specifically, I'm talking about the Gravedigger. Or as I like to call it, because of the Netflix episode we did, I just will forever call it the Grub Keeper now. Terrible boss fight. But do you know what, though? To your point, I absolutely see that perspective, and RE2 will always be my favourite. It's just locked now. I don't think I'm allowed to change it. I've said it so many times that it just it is what it is. It just holds that special place. But I've always been able to say my favourite game doesn't mean it's the best game. I could see the argument for RE3 being the best game for all the reasons that you guys have given. It's almost like, I don't know if I call it the most complete Resident Evil experience, because it depends what you want out of it, right? Like action to horror and stuff. It's very replayable. It rewards you for replaying it, not just with epilogues and all the alternatives, but it just feels great to play, and it's just a wonderful little package. So, yeah, I'm not mad about it. Steve, RE3, is it the best game?
Is it the best game on the PS1? Well, it's certainly better than Survivor, but...
hey, that's not... I mean, yeah, it is. No,
yeah, but, I mean, 21, 2 and then 1 and then 3. It's just the way it has to be. Like, I love Resident Evil 3, I really do. There's a lot of virtues that we've talked about over the course of this podcast. And even when compared to its remake, I'm very much in the, two cakes camp, I love those.
Yeah.
But, yeah, no, the nostalgia grind of Resident Evil 2 and then Resident Evil 1 being there at the beginning and like, oh, look how cool this is. Yeah, three's pretty tasty, but then you've mentioned boss fights, Si. I'm going to have to say, if you take Nemesis away, and then you've just got just the gravedigger / newly minted grub keeper. It's kind of an adventure without much of the spicy encounters, if you know what I mean. There is obviously the power station stuff. There is the odd live selection, but without those, it's a bit too grim. So I have to give it to 1 and 2 for that.
Fair.
That being said, though, it still beats Vincent's mother.
Kelsey, final thoughts on Resident Evil 3 Nemesis?
Yeah, so this game, it is, for me, the complete embodiment of cognitive dissonance, because for the for the longest time, and yeah, Si, you've taken so many words kind of out of my mouth, and then Sherwin has as well, because for the longest time, and it still is, RE2 has always been my favourite, and it always will be. It is, like you said, Si, it's locked in. Nothing's going to change that. We're too far gone now. I'm stuck in my ways. At the time, I never saw RE3 as my RE3. I was also a Code Veronica apologist, and it was always it felt like the next game in the series for me. It was the game I played loads more. I played RE3 a few times. I played Code Veronica on repeat. I loved it. It was always my RE3. As the years have passed, and certainly since doing this show and playing the remake, like what we've talked about today, and doing now, that's what I call survival horror as well. That was a pivotal moment for me for this game. Going through the soundtrack of RE3 and replaying it back then as well. I've come to realise that I was always too harsh on RE3 back in the day, and it is without question an astounding video game. In spite of the thin story that I've talked about, what they've crammed in here is nuts. And Steve is sort of saying, yeah, if you take that away, what else is it? And it's yeah, but that stuff is there, and you have to give it credit for these incredibly bold choices that Remake 3 could have done. Live selection doesn't seem like that's complicated to do these days, but Remake 3 didn't do it, and they did it back here. They added all that replayability, and everything they crammed in. The more I play it, the more it feels very much kind of a part of that timeline and the events that I fell in love with RE1 and RE2. And never again, despite the criticisms I have of the story, and I stand by that. I stand by the weakness of the characters in this. I think that I can put aside. Balancing the mythology and the experience I'm having with the tangible characters and what they're saying to each other, that's a fight that I sort of have with myself. There's so much in the files. There is character stuff deep in this game. When I think about everything that's crammed in here, it's yeah, there's no argument, and you won't ever hear me say a bad word about this game ever again, because there is some very difficult arguments to be had about which is the better game. And I know people who also love Resident Evil 2 as much as me that plainly admit, yeah, this is the better game. I mean, maybe I can admit it, but it's not my personal favorite. So it's cognitive dissonance embodied, because this game is incredible. But yeah, I'm old and nobody can change my mind about RE2, so
Well, nothing else remains for me but to thank the panel, our contributors, and our community. Join us on the First Day Spray Discord server to hear the show early, and check out our merch store or our Patreon to support the show. Don't forget that these and our social media links can be found at faspraypod.com. You can listen to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and all good podcasting apps. And if you like what you hear, please do leave us a review where you can and spread the good word. In the next episode, we're going to space. Yes, finally, we're taking First Day Spray into the stratosphere with our return to Comic Club as we cover Wildstorm's final Resident Evil issues with the 2009 RE5 prequel series. Thank you to the panel. You can follow the Pueblo people on social media. Myself and Steve are on Blue Sky at SciWhite and at FBSteve, and you can find Kelsey on Threads at KD_Buck. And finally, thank you for listening and have a good week.
I hate that Sherwin's right all the time.
Oh, it's just tiring, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a bit boring.
Try being me. It sucks.
Try being you.
You can support the show via our merchandise store or turn into a seal. Do that bit again.
And outtake secured.